Welcome to another tidbit from the Acts of the Apostles. We have arrived at chapter 25, and Paul now is met by a new procurator. He has been imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years, and Festus is replacing Felix. We don't know very much about Festus, actually, only a couple of remarks by the Jewish historian Josephus. But we know that he arrived in 58-59 somewhere time, and he died by an illness in year 62 AD. Now, Festus is giving an impression immediately of efficiency. He wants to uphold Roman law. He quickly summons Paul and the Jews who still are out to get Paul. The hate has not diminished. And we find that Festus is caught between the two interests, upholding Roman law and trying to be kind to the Jews in order to give them some favor in order to have probably the best possible relationship. And that was a very, very difficult task. Now, the first question that arises out of the story here is, why would Paul not go back to Jerusalem? We, of course, know that the Jews were about to kill him. Earlier there had been hired assassins. Festus may not know that. So in order to avoid being sent back to Jerusalem, Paul's case was, after all, a case within Jewish law and had nothing to do with the Roman law, which Festus probably quickly realized. In order to avoid that, Paul appealed to Caesar. In verses 10 to 12, Caesar is forefronted several times, I think 4 times altogether. So let's talk a little about the names or the titles used for the emperor. Originally, Caesar was a name for Gaius Julius Caesar. That was his family name, or not family name, but what is called his cognomen. His family name was Julius, and then he had the personal first name Gaius. But as his followers on the throne used the name Caesar, it later became the name for a Kaiser, as the Germans would say. And that is a term that is used several times here, but it is not the only title used. Let's move to verse 21. There Festus explains to Agrippa, when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. So here you have emperor and Caesar in one sentence. Caesar is from Caesar, while emperor is a translation of the Greek Sebastos. Sebastos meant the elevated. That was a common title, originally from the Latin Augustus. Augustus means the same, and Sebastos is the translation. Many monuments and cities were named for the emperor by being called Sebastius or Sebaste, for instance. So this was a common title for the emperor. There is one more in the chapter which is of a great interest, because later in verse 25, Festus continues, and as Paul himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. When the name emperor or title emperor is here used in translation, English Standard Version, this is from the Greek kurios, which means Lord, and which is a title that is given to Jesus, because that is the way the name of God in the Old Testament, Yahweh, was written in the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. So in Acts of the Apostles, Jesus is consistently called Kyrios. He is the Lord of all, Kyrios, in Acts 10:37. Here this title is used by and about the emperor, and that had been more and more common in those years, and the emperor, of course, finally would be worshipped as a god. Now, what's the story about here? The interesting thing is, from verse 17 and onwards, Festus is actually in the center of events. He is trying to explain, and this is the emphasis of Luke, trying to explain why he is calling in Agrippa. Agrippa and Berenike have arrived, and Festus wants their advice. He really does not know what it is best to say to the emperor in the letter he is sending to explain the emperor the reason for sending Paul. So that's his challenge, to find a reasonable letter, a justification for disturbing the emperor by sending Paul to be questioned in Rome. So he addresses Agrippa and Berenike, and in the following chapter we will see and listen to Paul speaking to these two. Who were they? Agrippa and Berenike were brother and sister. They lived together, but the Jews were not quite sure how they lived together, so there were some questions about incest and immorality. They were children of the Herod Agrippa, which we have met in chapter 12, who killed the apostle James and imprisoned Peter and had a horrible death. Now, this Agrippa was not as brutal. He had not the same influence. He was all his life on very good terms with the Roman aristocracy and the Roman imperial family. So was his sister Berenice. They had, by the way, a third sister. That was Drusilla, who had been married to Felix and whom we spoke about in a previous tidbit, the beautiful Jewish princess who died at the eruption of the volcano in Pompeii in the year 79. Now, Berenice was beautiful too, and she arrived in Rome and she became the mistress of Titus. Titus, the son of Vespasian, who became the emperor after the conquest of Jerusalem. Titus completed that conquest. When his father Vespasian died, Titus himself became the emperor, and he actually wanted to marry Berenice, who was a practicing Jew, but the Roman Senate and aristocracy did not like that, and on advice, Titus decided not to do so. So Berenice had an interesting story too. She was a practicing Jew. She's known to have fulfilled a vow. And now she, with her husband, not her husband, her brother, they lived together, Agrippa, came to listen to Paul. What he told them will be the topic in our next chapter, in chapter 26. Thank you for listening to Tidbits from